2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. After 8 decades, the exploits of the UK, the US, the then Soviet Union are justly well remembered. But the role of China, the Allied so-called fourth policeman, remains largely forgotten, at least in the West. To find out why and how World War II is seen in China, I spoke to Rana Mitter, ST Lead Chair in US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School and author of, amongst many other titles, Forgotten Ally, China's World War II. Rana, you literally wrote the book on China as the forgotten ally of the Second World War. What was its role in the conflict?
Jamie, one of the things that I think is important to understand is that China played, in many ways, a very central role in World War II. The reason I want to stress that is that in the wider Western world, we tend to think of the big three: the United States of America, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, all of which were absolutely key actors in the ultimate Allied victory over the Nazis and Japan. But China also played a very, very central role in terms of the overall strategy. And I would say that if you had to pin down the one thing that was crucial in terms of China's role, it was China's ability to suck in and draw in thousands upon thousands of Japanese soldiers for year after year, when the Japanese thought in 1937, 38 that they would launch essentially a lightning strike into China, take it over or make it essentially almost a colony. And in fact, Chinese resistance meant that they had to keep going on and eventually expand the war in Asia to try and achieve their goals. Without Chinese resistance, without the Chinese role, that Japanese role in Asia might have been very different, not just then, but even in the decades following.
Why is China's role then forgotten, at least perhaps in the West?
I think it's fair to say that there are a couple of reasons that China's role in World War II has been either forgotten or perhaps downplayed, is the way to put it. One set of reasons comes from the Western side, which is that there's an extent to which, because in the Cold War, just like the Soviet Union, China went from becoming a wartime ally to essentially becoming a Cold War adversary within a very short period of time. There wasn't really the audience to remember that wartime experience, which was only a few years before, but which sat in a very different sort of historical context. It's also worth noting that actually to do detailed studies of the history of wartime China involves reading documents in Chinese and Japanese, and the number of historians in the West who were trained in those sorts of languages back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s was fewer in number than it is today. But it's also worth noting that China's politics was very, very closed in the early Cold War period. Essentially, Western historians couldn't get to China to look at archives, interview survivors, look at documents. Those opportunities were simply not available. And without being able to look at the documents and talk to the survivors, the chance for any Westerner to actually write about China's wartime history was much, much lower than would have ideally been the case. That situation only really began to change in the 1980s, when China was more open and able to open up those conversations with Western and Japanese historians, really for the first time since the beginning of the Cold War.
Should we blame historians then for this partial history?
I don't think blame is necessarily the right way to look at this question. The question is also more about the way in which publics and the political world tends to look at the legacy of World War II. The fact is that for most major belligerents in World War II, whether they were on the Allied or Axis side, it's the history of their own countries which tend to sit more centrally in public memory. So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, a country which still defines itself in many ways, according to its World War II experience, more than 80 years after the end of the conflict, it is the great heroic moments, the Battle of Britain, the Spitfires flying above the Channel to try and push back, ultimately successfully push back the Nazi threat, This is the sort of thing which helps to shape the idea of why Britain's role mattered in a Europe that was being conquered. For the United States, there is both a European and an Asian set of memories. In Europe, in terms of the central role that the Americans played in D-Day, of course, led, of course, by an American General Eisenhower, but also, of course, an Asian war, but an Asian war for America that was primarily from Pearl Harbor onwards about fighting in the Pacific Ocean. And so in that context, perhaps because the other major allies, the Soviets, the Americans and the British, were not physically present as combatants for the most part in the China theatre. That's really, I think, one of the reasons why China's role has been less understood. Even the parts that did involve some significant combat experience. I'm thinking here of the American Flying Tigers, the nickname for the American Volunteer Group under General Claire Lee Chennault, which operated until Pearl Harbor when the Americans could officially enter the war. Even that actually quite well remembered collaboration or assistance that came to China is usually told in terms of the way in which America was ramping up unofficial assistance even before Pearl Harbor happened. It's not really been so much a story about the way in which military developments in China changed during those wartime years. And that's one of the areas of historical research which does demand more digging into the archives, more engagement with Chinese material. It's happening slowly and steadily, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Do you think racism or cultural misunderstanding have played into Western attitudes towards China's role in the war?
I think it's more important to say that actually one of the major problems that there has been with the understanding of China's role is that China was simply a society where it wasn't possible to actually get to the details of what had happened during those wartime years. But there were, and indeed are, Westerners who have spent a great deal of time, I think, during that period trying to understand China's role and how it changed. Let me give one example, actually, of a famous Briton who I think became very, very fascinated by China because of his wartime experience. And that's the Cambridge scientist Joseph Needham, who is remembered even now in China as one of the foreigners who not only came to China in the wartime years, but used that experience of trying to bring about Western-Chinese scientific collaboration to try and help the Chinese war effort to actually learn more about China. And he, as a result of that experience, as a direct result of being in China during World War II, mostly in and around the temporary wartime capital at Chongqing, became the initiator of one of the great academic projects that still exists today, the multi-volume project called Science and Civilization in China, largely based actually today in Cambridge, England, through the Needham Research Institute, which gave a chance for the Western world to understand how much scientific research had actually been birthed and developed in China over the centuries.
How is the Second World War viewed in China now? It's viewed simply as part of a longer conflict, isn't it?
I'd say that the way in which World War II is remembered in China today has changed. It's metamorphosed, you might say, over the course of the last few decades. During the period, let's say from the 1940s up to the mid-1970s, really the years when Mao Zedong was in charge of China, the story is in some ways a very internal one. It was largely about Chinese resistance to Japan, but without really the acknowledgement of many different Chinese actors being involved. It was only really the Chinese Communist Party alone that Mao talked about, and the other actors were really very downplayed. And also the very important role of foreign actors, the United States, the British, and of course, to some extent, the Soviet Union as well. These were stories that weren't really told extensively during those first few decades after the war was over. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why that Chinese wartime history didn't make it into the wider historical understanding, because China at that point wasn't in the kind of international academic and political conversations where people compared and contrasted their wartime experience. Now, fast forward to much more contemporary times, let's say from the 1980s, 90s onwards. That's when China has thought much more about its role in World War II as part of a global war. Quite often you'll hear terms such as global anti-fascist war used in China today as a way of understanding that kind of wider transnational importance that China had during that period. And so it's worth noting that today there's much more acknowledgement, much more engagement with the then government of China, the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek, which was the internationally recognized government of China at the time, operating in a united alliance with the Chinese Communist Party at that time, but nonetheless with the nationalists very much obviously running the government at that time. That was really a large part of the way in which, in practice, China played a role in the global war, and that's been much more openly and much more directly engaged with in Chinese understanding of the war in the last 2 or 3 decades. That's a significant contrast from what you would have found during the height of the Cold War.
I wonder then, given that, whether or not our understanding will change further in the coming decades as more research is done into the archives.
I think it will. I think one of the things that we note at the moment is that there are lots of areas about the wartime experience that we still don't have full knowledge of. For instance, the way in which many of the regional leaders of China operated during that time. So let's take an example of Guangxi in southwest China. We're aware that there were military figures who late in the wartime years were possibly interested in using the turmoil that was caused by the wartime period, perhaps to seize control themselves or part of China. We simply don't know very much about that history. There needs to be more work in the local archives, digging down into the details of what went on to reconstruct the story, not just as top-down, not just from the wartime capitals, you might say, of China, Chongqing, where the nationalist government was based, Yan'an, which was the Chinese Communist headquarters, Nanjing, where the collaborationist government of Wang Jingwei operated. Even these stories still need more detail under them. There's plenty to learn.
Paint a picture then, if you would, of China before the start of the Second World War. What kind of country do we see?
China of the 1930s, which is the country that eventually, on the 7th of July 1937, after the clash between locally garrisoned Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, the Lugotiao, would plunge into war, it was a society that in some ways was intriguing, massively intriguing, because it could have gone in so many other different ways. By the 1930s, China was, on the one hand, like much of the rest of the world, in the grip of the global depression. The economic situation in China was not great. But the then government of China, the nationalists, or Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek, had managed to consolidate their rule with a new capital at Nanjing in 1928. Now, this wasn't wholly acknowledged by other actors in China. There were other militarist leaders, sometimes nicknamed warlords, who did not recognize the government's authority. The communist movement clearly did not recognize their authority either. But China was beginning to consolidate. It was building industrial strength. It went through major reform in terms of its currency in 1935. There was a lot of work done with the assistance of the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN, in terms of flood control and other elements of the natural disasters which had racked China during that time. In other words, you could see real development, real economic change, real consolidation in the China of that era. And although, of course, there were rival political movements, including notably the communists who did not accept that settlement at the time, you can see scenarios in which China steadily might have got itself together in terms of becoming a consolidated, solid state in Asia. But essentially, the Japanese presence in China, which had been there really ever since the 1890s, early 20th century, continued to essentially assert that China was an area of special interest for Japan, that in some ways it should have special rights that would not accrue to any other country at that stage. And that continued undermining of China's sense of sovereignty at that time became an increasingly problematic issue for the Chinese government at the time. In 1931, the northeastern provinces of China, Manchuria as they were generally known at the time, were essentially taken over in essentially a kind of coup by the Japanese resident army, the Guangdong Army at that time, on the 18th September 1931. Now, although that didn't lead to all-out war between the two countries at that time, it put China's government on notice that a confrontation with Japan might be coming at some time sooner rather than later. A little like the debates that happened in Europe around the question of appeasement, the Chinese government debated with itself about how best to prepare for a coming war and when would be the moment when China would finally have to say, thus far and no further. So that kind of contingency in the 1930s underpinned all political, economic, and diplomatic decisions that Chiang Kai-shek and his government had to make at that time.
Let's talk about some specifics, events like the Nanjing massacre, the bombing of Chongqing, especially devastating and are known globally. How did atrocities like these shape both domestic morale and international perception of the conflict?
Many horrific events took place in wartime China as a result of the Japanese invasion. Some of the most famous have become, globally notorious. The massacre of Nanjing in the winter of 1937 into early 1938, where many, many thousands of people were killed. Many women were subjected to horrific sexual assault. We have records from missionaries and other third country actors who wrote down what they saw at that time, and it remained burned in their minds in many cases. An event, or set of events, I should say, which perhaps is less well known in the wider world but should be remembered, is the constant air raid bombings that took place on the wartime capital at Chongqing, known in the West as Chungking at the time, still of course a major city in southwest China today. And starting really in the spring and summer of 1938, you get repeated air raids across the city from Japanese bombers trying to basically turn it into a rubble-strewn wasteland that would demoralize and essentially destroy any capacity that the national government of China had to continue its resistance to Japan. Perhaps one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious, of those air raids took place on a historically symbolic date, the 3rd and 4th of May 1939, when I think 27 separate sorties took place across the city of Chongqing, involving not just regular bombing, that would be bad enough, but incendiary bombing, which would set the many wooden buildings on fire. Now, for many Chinese, particularly those who had a sense of strongly patriotic identity, that date was very symbolic, because exactly 20 years before, on the 4th of May 1919, a patriotic student demonstration in the centre of Beijing had been one of the first markers that a young nationalistic youth no longer wanted to see China in the kind of downtrodden position that it had been from the late 19th century onwards. And so to have those air raids taking place 20 years exactly to the day of those demonstrations, in some cases actually, I think, fueled further resistance. We could take one of the great Chinese writers of that era, the novelist Lao She, and he wrote a piece actually written in the suburbs of Chongqing at that time called The Real Meaning of May 4th, in which he talked about how these kind of actions, this the attempted destruction of the city, would only encourage the Chinese people to actually push back further. And as we know, in 8 years of massive resistance and fight back, all the way to 1945, broadly speaking, that did prove the case.
How did China's resistance impact Allied strategies in the Pacific?
China's resistance was immensely important overall to what became the wider Allied strategy. Now, it's worth remembering that what we think of as the wartime alliance, both in Europe and the Soviet Union, it's worth remembering that what we think of as the wartime alliance, both in Europe and Asia, actually only came together over time. We can only really talk about wartime alliances in the full sense from 1941, when the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Barbarossa, takes place, and then, of course, famously Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Before that, you have separate European and Asian wars, which eventually come together in 1941. That's worth remembering when we think about the Chinese contribution, because 1938, a year which isn't always widely taken into account in terms of the wider war, is crucial. 1938, the middle of 1938, is about a year after full-scale war breaks out between China and Japan, so summer 1937 to 38. And in the middle of 1938, many, many foreign observers think that China is pretty much being pushed back against the wall. The great cities of China's cultural heartland, Nanjing, Beijing, Shanghai, they have fallen. They've either surrendered, or in the case of Shanghai, a brave battle, with thousands and thousands of deaths of Chinese soldiers has taken place, but the cities have been lost and the government's retreated to the interior. So many people, including some Chinese, think that at that point the only thing you can do is essentially bring about a negotiated peace. And Chiang Kai-shek and his wary communist allies actually said no. At this point, we are going to continue to fight back. We will continue to resist. And we now know that if China and Chiang Kai-shek's national government had not continued to offer resistance in mid-1938, instead of doing what some people might have thought was a more logical outcome of doing a deal with the Japanese, then actually the war in Asia looks completely different. You don't have that outcome of continued Chinese resistance, almost solo, not quite, but almost solo, all the way to Pearl Harbor, which then becomes part of a joint war the Allies fight in Europe and Asia. And that contribution, China's resistance that allows the global war that we know of as World War II eventually to come together, bringing the might, the industrial power of the United States, the capacity of the British Empire into the fight, none of that might have happened if China had not fought back, continued fighting from 1938 onwards. So that Chinese contribution to the overall war, including ultimately being the backstop to the war in the Pacific, that is very, very important.
And it allows Soviet forces to focus then on the Western Front.
Exactly right. The Soviet Union, of course, it's worth remembering, is neutral in the war in Asia all the way until what we now think of as the last weeks of the war in 1945. It doesn't mean they didn't do anything. It's worth remembering that the Soviet Union did, in the first part of China's war, provide unofficial but very important Soviet air cover over Shanghai and some other major cities, because the Chinese Air Force simply wasn't capable of providing that kind of air cover. Now, Stalin obviously did that very much on the quiet because he didn't want the Soviet Union to be pulled into a formal war against Japan. But that assistance did matter to the nationalist government at the time. But then, broadly speaking, through all those years, the Soviets are neutral in the Asian War, and that changes, of course, very much at the end of the war, when finally, after Yalta, Stalin agrees, after a pause, to bring Soviet troops into the war in Asia. But up to that point, of course, the Soviets have been concentrating on the second front in Europe, and we now know, of course, that with D-Day on the western side and the Soviet advance into Eastern Europe and ultimately towards Berlin on the Eastern European side, that Europe First strategy was underpinned by knowing that China and the Pacific War would come second, but that it would be necessary, first of all, to defeat Hitler.
In what way does this forgotten history shape contemporary China's national identity and foreign policy?
I think that many aspects of China's identity and foreign policy are very heavily shaped by the experience of World War II. And first of all, in terms of thinking of itself as a state which essentially has pushed back against foreign invasion, the Japanese invasion, 1930s, 1940s, I think still sits very centrally in what you might call the Chinese historical imagination. Obviously, anyone in China, and that includes many of the emergent middle class who often go to Japan on their holidays, know that today's Japan is nothing like the Japan of that earlier time. Today, it's a peaceful society, one with a peace constitution that has essentially been an economic powerhouse, but is not in any sense a major military actor. So I think most Chinese who know Japan and know about it know that the history doesn't necessarily predict the present in that sense. But that wider sense of worrying about foreign presence in the outside world is something that I think World War II still sits as a kind of predecessor in people's minds in terms of how the outside world and China have interacted. If we get to some specifics, I would say that one of the areas in which World War II history has become most notable in contemporary Chinese language is around one particular organization, the United Nations. Because you will hear Chinese leaders fairly often, actually, in public statements, talking about the way in which the world should remember that China was the first signatory to the United Nations Charter back in San Francisco in April 1945. And that's very much the case. Chiang Kai-shek's government did send a significant delegation to San Francisco to essentially sign off on that agreement. And the reason that that's important is that it gives China a sense that it was part of what Dean Acheson, the future American Secretary of State, would call being present at the creation. In other words, of a world system, a new framework that emerged out of World War II. Now, it's always been the case, for some good logical reasons, that the United States in particular, also the Soviet Union, and indeed Britain, have been regarded as central to the shaping of that world, which came through conferences in places like Dumbarton Oaks, Bretton Woods, and the various kind of foreign ministers' conferences that happened after that. But it is often downplayed that China was also an actor and a presence in the conferences that ended World War II and created a new global order. And in that sense, China today likes to stress that its World War II contributions were an important part of having a seat at that table, a table which still exists, of course, in terms of the UN and its role.
Well, let's talk about that. Many of the international groups that shaped the world order after the Second World War, you've mentioned the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, are looking, shall we say, increasingly shaky, especially as the global south, including China, fights to get its voice heard. What's your take on this 80 years on? Is that global regime that you talked about, built up after the war, still relevant?
I think that actually we can look at the emerging global order in a slightly different way. And I would say that if you're looking at the world view from Jakarta or from Lagos or from Rio de Janeiro, the way the world is changing actually in some ways looks almost like an opportunity. Let me explain what I mean by that. Bigger players in the world, the United States, China, Russia, are essentially changing many aspects of the 1945 world order. There's no doubt about that. But because there are so many new opportunities for growing and emerging economies in the global south, I think that many of them see actually the changing order as an opportunity for them to be able to make their voices heard. One of the things that was very notable about the Cold War period was that sometimes the big actors, and that could be Beijing, it could be Washington, it could be Moscow, felt that they could actually speak for other actors in the wider world. I think that that is something that the New World Order is no longer going to make a likely outcome. Places in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, are going to speak in their own voices. And to some extent, Beijing, Washington, Moscow are going to have to listen more to what those actors have to say. In other words, a fluid time, and we're certainly in a fluid time at the moment, is one where all sides are able to make demands. Of course, the great powers will put forward their idea of what they think the world should be like, but they may be surprised about how much the other actors, particularly acting through organizations such as ASEAN in Southeast Asia, actually have their own ideas about what might come next. And it's not a bad thing, I think, for the big powers to be in dialogue rather than in broadcast-only mode when it comes to that changing world order.
Why does redefining World War II narrative matter in today's geopolitical landscape?
For many people in the outside world, what's sometimes been called the rise of China, the emergence of China as a military and economic major power in the world, seemed almost to come out of nowhere. Suddenly between being this immensely impoverished country in the 1980s to being a country that actually obviously sits at the top of the world geopolitical table in the present day, seems to have almost caught people by surprise. I would say that looking at China's wartime history and understanding how that period of forging, of creating a new China in which actually various political actors came together to push back against an invasion, against occupation, and create a new type of political understanding. That's very important as background for understanding where the world emerges today. If we think about organizations like the United Nations, why, for instance, does China have one of the 5 permanent seats, the P5 seats, in New York today? And the answer is that China's wartime contributions in fighting with the Allies and against the Axis powers earned it the right, given by the Allies together, by President Roosevelt in particular, gave it the right to actually sit at that top table. Now, that is an inheritance from World War II that is still very important, obviously, to China's international diplomacy today, but is very much a product directly of China's wartime contribution, and one that, if people didn't know about that wartime period, might seem puzzling as to why China would have been given that particular seat way back in 1945.
Rana Mitter, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.